exhibit. Then you start with your, this is the, that is Jen Otima. Yes, I see you guys are very good students.
You to just show me how to move next.
And there are 4 areas that we measure in, affordability being one of them, and I think that's the crux of this conversation. But there's also the question, and I think it was kind of tangentially mentioned here, about habitability, the quality of the dwelling, and whether people are happy about that. And I think that also did come through. But we also take housing to be beyond just the walls and the roof. So it's about the services around that, water, sanitation, and all the services that are associated with that. And then there was the element that you talked about, tenure security. And that actually has implications on incremental housing, because if you own it and you feel secure enough in your ownership, then you can take your time. You have the agency to move at your own pace. So these are 4 critical areas that we work on. At the heart of all that, in terms of our theory of change, is the centrality of people. And that is why this conversation is extremely important. And if you look at that poster over there, and we are talking about data this morning, we have some data that tells us that about 271 people, 238 million people in sub-Saharan Africa live in informal settlements. And that's why we have a campaign that we launched in May called Home Equals. It's about, improving the quality of living in the informal settlements, but it's also an appreciation of the criticality of informal settlements in themselves as part of our lived experience. Because home equals longer lives. Home equals equality. Home equals education. Home equals health. And so we can also have a conversation about that. And I mentioned this just to emphasize why this is important. But so why today and why this report? If we are to succeed in making sure people have access to finance for their housing, we've got to know. We've got to know where the shoe pinches. We've got to know where the barriers are. And that is why this research was extremely important.
We wanted to see what has changed since 2017. And that is the most important part of this study for us at KMRC. We certainly recognize that access is not the only issue, although we were talking about access. Other than access, affordability is the other key issue that affects public housing policy. And those are actually the 2 key issues that we have to resolve to make housing work. Now, I'm delighted that our consultant did this, and of course we have all seen, and I'm not going to bore you going back into what has been presented here because you have all seen. But the most important thing is, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with the information that is in our hands? We certainly are not going to make it gather some dust somewhere. We believe in taking action. And that action we shall take. And the study has highlighted key issues, key interventions, actually some of which KMRC is currently actualizing. Now, you know, housing is very personal. It's actually an emotional investment. And it's, I think, the most important investment in your lifetime. But occasionally they say at least 25% of people anywhere around the world will never have to own a home in their lifetime. You know, so some studies say that. And that's just looking at the practicality of creating opportunities for people to own homes. But you know, we must not only talk about home ownership. We can also talk about rental. You certainly need to have a shelter. Now, but even as you look at the study, and certainly also part of the importance of having it, is we want to understand what do our communities need because of the personal nature of housing. What do our customers need? Sometimes we assume we know what our customers need. And when you look at, for example, the supply side of housing, the construction of housing, a developer sits down and imagines that this is what people need. So they just need a small house of 22 square meters or less or something like that with these basic amenities and that kind of thing. But is that what people need? You know, the majority of the people need to be understood so that we actually provide solutions that resonate with the people. And that not only applies with supply, but it also equally applies to housing finance. As we come up with products, innovative products for that matter, they must resonate with what certainly our community needs. And so that's why a study of this kind is important, for us to be able to see what do we need to do and what actually do our people need. In our case at KMRC, and maybe for some of you who have not appreciated or worked with KMRC in the past, our customers are actually financial institutions, banks, and the SACCOs. And Oscar, for your information, we're actually working with some microfinance institutions. Like we have, as part of KMRC, Kenya Women Microfinance. And so we recognize the importance. And I think there was some discussion earlier around, you know, we potentially don't need collateral, but even when you look at microfinance, it's actually collateral. Social collateral is collateral, right? So it's important to understand that we certainly will have to look at maybe what form of intervention we need to make, whether we need social collateral and how do we make sure that we manage risks. I think the most fundamental issue around all this is risk management and potentially how we can improve risk management. Our emphasis remains at KMRC to encourage more home ownership and obviously to encourage a lot more offtake of housing. And that certainly we need because we appreciate the externalities. You know, housing certainly has both economic and social externalities. Economic development goes with it. And now, when you look at the housing secretary earlier talking to you about the housing levy, which they are very passionate about. So now we need to be very passionate about encouraging our people to take up housing. You know, you're already contributing, right? Do you have a reason of not encouraging someone to take for something that you're contributing to? So we would look at enhancing some of the products we offer. Like, for example, when you look at part of what you have seen in the study, it includes, for example, matters to do with the variability of rates. Actually, they say around 88% of credit in Kenya is variable rates.
Those of us who have been very keen in the economic landscape, those who have been very keen in the legislative landscape, and in the political landscape, there's nothing that is capturing the urgency of government more than the issue of housing. For the first time in the history of our country, we are discussing issues. For the first time in the history of our country, Kenyans were engaged in the discussion on the Finance Act. Before, we used to know about budgets. You know, to us, budgets were images of the finance minister coming with a briefcase and long, boring hours. But this year, budget meant something for us. And at the center of that budget, we almost felt the only thing about that budget was the issue about the housing levy. So as I stand here to represent my peers, I also feel very guilty because a lot of us have seen deductions from their payrolls, from their pay slips. We have deducted, and I can see Absa is not smiling. We have deducted 1.5% from a pay slip in the last month. And unfortunately, and very, very fortunately for the country, that shall be going on for the next many, many years. And that's why this particular session is very, very important, because this session is about housing financing. And that housing tax is about housing financing for the country. So they could, if I was making a presentation, then would have gone to explain a lot of things. But I want to say something picking up from where the Vice President said. Two things that he said. That this housing financing is about people. Which people are we talking about in our country? That's a very important question, because a lot of times when you talk about financing matters, we are talking about very abstract situation. When Pauline, is that Pauline, who was making a presentation, she told us 4 million Kenyans stay in slum areas. In fact, the figure is 6 million. But I want to bring it home to you about our own families. What does that mean? The most elite of our youth today, of our children, our brothers and sisters, are the ones who go to the university. Is that so? Do you know that 70% of university students live in slums? We just do not want to accept. They live in slums. Go to KU, you know, and those wars that you have seen. 70% of our children, the most elite, they live in slum areas. Do you know that when they leave university, a lot of them don't vacate those houses, they continue living in slums? That's the reality. Those are graduates. They live in slum areas. So we are talking about something real to us, something that affects our brothers and sisters, whom most times we are forced to live with. And why is it so? And it has been explained here. It is because of a market crisis. There's a market crisis where, one, we do not have sufficient houses for people. The houses that are there for the people, and Pauline has said, the market provides 50,000 housing units per year. Our annual demand is 250,000. So every year we are accumulating 200,000. What is the backlog? 2 million houses. So even when we talk about 200,000 per year, we already have a 2 million gap, which is there, that is yet to be filled. It's a big crisis we have. And of those 50,000, Pauline has told us, and is correct, only 1,000 cover the majority of our population. So, therefore, the discussion here is very important, and I really want us to encourage this discussion to continue. We shall use the findings that are there to try and provide a solution, because I stand here as government. Government is a duty bearer. We have a responsibility The private sector, they are there for their shareholders. But the government shareholders are the people of Kenya. That's why for us, the housing tax and levy, it's an existential intervention. It is existential. What will it do for our people? In the next 2 years, we shall be offering 1-bedroom houses at 5,000 shillings, rent to own. Rent to own. 10,000 shillings for 2-bedroom houses, rent to own. 15,000 shillings for 3-bedroom houses, rent to own. Across the country. We are changing the landscape. So when you are thinking about financing, think differently, because this is public money. That's why it is important. We do not have the resources. In the initial birth of our country, we used to have government agencies providing housing, the National Housing Corporation and all that. But in the 80s, the World Bank came and told us under a structural adjustment program that government must get out of health, it must get out of housing, and it must leave it to the private sector. Okay? And government got out of housing. Indeed, the National Housing Corporation, from the early 80s, it never got a single shilling from the public. So, the money you are paying, really, you must be very proud to live in this generation. All of us as Kenyans, we must be very, very, very proud to live in this generation. Because we are witnessing something that will revolutionize. And it's not just about housing. Can you imagine a young man who is at the university or is a graduate, for whom you can even pay 5,000 shillings owning a house? I never owned a house almost 5-10 years after I left university. There was no formula. Particularly those of us who are Muslims, and all your financing is based on interest. It's crazy. You know, there's no such a thing that you ever imagine that you can own a house. So when that happens, that young man and woman will be asset owners. When somebody is an asset owner, can you imagine the ripple effect? When you have chased away your son and daughter from your house, tell him, nitakulipia nyumba, sort yourself out. So they'll be able to hustle. Because the biggest cost is housing, isn't it? You know, can you imagine the effect of it, first of all? The effect of it. You know? This is very transformational for our country. And we are not saying we are going to do it. I told you in 2 years' time, perhaps less. It's because currently we have rolled out over 70,000 houses are being built now as we talk. In Nairobi, there's Starehe there's 6,000 houses being built. Shauri Moyo, 3,500 houses. Ruiru and Thika, they are there. And you don't need to know anybody. You just require register in Boma Yangu, and then you access the houses that are there.